Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our guest is on his way, so if I could ask you all to take a seat. If I could ask my colleagues to take a seat as well, please. If I could ask our guests on that side of the room, could you move up and fill the seats in front? Please don't be shy. Thank you very much. No, it's reserved for you all. Please come and please do join us. Sit in the front row. Please go ahead. Thank you all very much. Oh, they may not sit there, or they might actually go straight up.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, General David Petraeus. General David Petraeus, Mr. Bilahari Kausikan, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michelle Teo, and I'm the Executive Director at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. Welcome to our 2024 Roundup, an opportunity to take a look back at the year and all that has happened in the Middle East. Our speakers today need little introduction. General David Petraeus is no stranger to MEI, having been our 2023 SR Northern Distinguished Speaker. With a long and distinguished military career and a deep understanding of the Middle East, I am certain he will have much to consider and much to say. I'm also very pleased to welcome MEI's former chairman, Mr. Bilahari Kausikan. Career diplomat, prolific commentator, and frank analyst, this will be a lively discussion today. Please join me in welcoming both gentlemen as I now hand over to them. Bilahari, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. Our guest, General Petraeus, needs no introduction, really needs no introduction. And although Michelle said speakers, I do not intend to speak. My role is merely to ask questions and let General Petraeus answer. How I would organize this is that I will start the conversation with him for about 20 minutes or so by asking him a few questions, and then open it to the floor. By the way, there's also people online, and they will also be feeding questions through this device here if it works. If not, I shall make up some questions and say they came from online. Anyway, General Petraeus, welcome to Singapore again. Thank you for coming to be with us.
Great to be with you, thanks. And thanks to all of you for being here this afternoon. I know there's a lot of ambassadors and DCMs and others in here who are all going to help grade my work, and I look forward to that. I appreciate the abbreviated introduction. That meant that I did not have to hear again how I was the runner-up for Time Person of the Year in 2007 to Vladimir Putin. I'm happy to report more recently than 2022, I was sanctioned by Putin for my support of Ukraine. And again, I'm quite proud of that. But it is great to be back on this stage. It's great to be back with you. You're now the chairman emeritus, I believe.
No, we don't use that title.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. Once a chairman, always a chairman. Okay. But it is great to be back on stage with you. And after a year that has been just extraordinary in the seismic developments in the region that we know and love and study and spent a lot of time in over the years.
Well, unless somebody has been living under a rock for the last year, you will know there have been momentous changes in the Middle East, particularly in just the last week. How would you sum up the geopolitical changes that have occurred over the last year and in the last week?
Well, if you start on October 8th, not October 7th, and I know the Israeli ambassador is in here somewhere, and if you'd raise your hand, that'd be helpful. Thank you for that. I think you were here last year, I think. And you can shake your head or nod as you see fit. But if you start with October 8th, not October 7th, I think you would sum it up by saying that Israel has, I don't know that you'd say they have won, but they have achieved extraordinary results. Iran has definitely lost. Hezbollah has lost, Russia has lost, and Turkey has actually achieved some considerable results as well. Let me explain, but let me start, I guess, by noting, I think it's very important to keep the developments of the last year and a month or so in perspective, from an Israeli perspective. Because I think what you have to do is recognize how traumatic 7 October was for the Israelis. And I'm not sure you can sense that unless you've actually been there on the ground, talked to people, and realized that there is no Israeli who was not touched by what took place, either a member of their own family or a very close friend or relative. To put it in context from an American perspective, recalling that we lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks, the losses that Israel sustained are the equivalent of 40,000 Americans killed and 7,000 taken hostage. So again, that gives you some sense. This is the worst intelligence failure in Israel's history, and there have been some others. October 73 would be one of those. It's the worst military readiness failure in Israeli history. The response to this was totally inadequate. And it was the worst political miscalculation in Israeli history because the leadership of Israel thought that Hamas was becoming somewhat of a decent neighbor, enjoying the additional worker visas that were being provided, seemed to be a positive trend at the least. And of course, what the Hamas was doing was using those additional worker visas to conduct reconnaissance, to pinpoint the different locations that they were very expertly going to take out before carrying out the absolutely horrific and barbaric attacks, and filming them and uploading them as well. So that was October 7th. Since then, if you want to start with Hamas, Israel has dramatically degraded the capabilities of Hamas. They have also rightly, in my view, taken control of the southern border between Israel and the Sinai, Egypt, which enables them to prevent the rearming of Hamas, which used to take place through the Rafah crossing in the south and also through the tunnels that went underneath that southern border known as the Philadelphia corridor. And they should not give that up, and the Americans shouldn't push them to give that up for some kind of short-term hostage deal and a ceasefire. Israel, I think, needs to retain it. What Israel has not done, however, is destroy Hamas, which was the actual stated objective by the Prime Minister, nor have they prevented Hamas from having influence in the territory, because Israel has been conducting a campaign that could be characterized as clear and leave. They've done enormous damage to Hamas, again, also enormous damage to civilian infrastructure, and there's been very considerable loss of life. And they have also not gotten the hostages back fully. They've gotten a number of them, but there's roughly 100 or so still that are not accounted for, certainly not back in hands, either body or live individuals. And this is the one place, I think, where Israel has not pursued the strategy that I believe is necessary, and therefore has had very significant gains in degrading Hamas. There's no way Hamas can carry out this kind of attack again or anytime soon. But what I believe needs to be added as an additional objective to the three stated, which are destroy Hamas, prevent Hamas from governing Gaza again, and get the hostages back, there should be an additional objective, which is to provide a better life for the Palestinian people in Gaza without Hamas being part of that life. And the only way to accomplish this is to achieve security. I understand why Israel doesn't want to do this. I've had long conversations with now former Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant, with whom I had a very close relationship. But you would have to go into Gaza and actually create what we call gated communities in the world of counterinsurgency, which is what we did during the surge in Iraq, where you literally put a wall across north-south. This is a very small territory, frankly. And you could just go in from the north, put a wall east-west, a couple north-south. You have three gated communities. You clear them painstakingly of all of the Hamas elements. You issue biometric ID cards to those who belong there. You get them into better shelter. And now you can have an organized provision of humanitarian assistance, restoration of basic services, and begin the reconstruction of all the damaged infrastructure, homes, and so on. And you could do this with help, in this case, if you have gotten Hamas out, help from Arab countries, help from Palestinians that we really should have been training already in the Jordan International Police Training Center. I think the Jordanian ambassador is here as well. I mean, that center is a strategic asset. As you know, we trained tens of thousands of Iraqi police when I was a three-star in Iraq, and many Palestinians over decades as well. And then you just keep repeating the process. Now it's going to get tougher and tougher because Hamas is going to get pushed down. Eventually you're going to have a number of fights as you get into the south. But only Israel can do this. Palestinian forces will not do this. Arab forces will not do this. The World Food Program right now, their trucks go in, they get hijacked by guys with guns who are criminal elements, Hamas remnants, or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And until you achieve security, you really can't achieve that objective that I believe is necessary to achieve as well. On the other hand, with respect to Hezbollah, Israel has done absolutely incredibly well. The supply chain operation, which got thousands of pagers into the hands of Hezbollah leaders and required you to put both thumbs on it, because what actually triggered it was an encrypted message, which is decrypted with both thumbs, so it's literally in your face. Thousands of leaders taken out. So this is not decapitation. This is decimation of the leadership of Hezbollah. After a year during which they continued to bombard Israel and the villages of the north every single day with dozens of rockets and even anti-tank guided missiles and so forth, which forced over 65,000 Israelis to leave their homes for an extended period of time. So Israel had to carry out this operation. They did it brilliantly. The day after the pagers blew up, of course, the walkie-talkies blew up. That was the final means of communication they had. They'd already had to give up their smartphones because they knew that the Israelis could geolocate them if they used those. So they not only killed or wounded the thousands of the top leadership, they also rendered them incapable, the survivors, of conducting command, control, and communications, which meant that the most feared option of Hezbollah, which is to overwhelm the Israeli sophisticated air and ballistic missile defense system, was not possible. They did certainly on some days launch probably hundreds perhaps, but the system was capable of dealing with those in most cases. There were some that did get through. But that has put Hezbollah in such a weakened state and a state in which they've been reduced from having 150,000 or so missiles, rockets, drones, to well under 25,000 at this point in time, and probably even less than that with the additional operations that have been carried out. So a huge achievement there. I think that is deserving of the term victory. And that has forced the Hezbollah to accept a ceasefire, which is now being implemented and will get them out of the area between the northern border of Israel and the Litani River, which will mean that the most ubiquitous form of rockets, the 122 millimeters, can't reach those villages that were terrorized by Hezbollah before. So a very, very significant achievement. That also was one of the factors that set up the possibility of HTS, the former element associated with al-Qaeda that broke away from it, to be able to topple the Bashar al-Assad regime forces as rapidly as they did. The other factors were, of course, the Russian preoccupation with Ukraine and unable to send thousands of troops in there that could guide, and many close air support aircraft and so forth. Hezbollah, again, also was not there in thousands the way they were before. And then no other forces could be mustered quickly enough. The Iraqi Shia militia probably rightly saw this as a losing proposition. And of course, the forces of Bashar, which had been really weakened very significantly by the operations that were being carried out, melted away as they saw that no one was coming to the rescue. And the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which showed itself to be so inflexible when it came to negotiating with the different partners with various grievance, instead were taken out by quite a skilled umbrella group, HTS again, which has underneath it dozens of different militias. Again, these are all different flavors and types, different leaders and so forth. And that is a seismic change, needless to say. In truth, I wish that the U.S. had done much, much more to enable the moderate opposition back in the early days of the Arab Spring in Syria, which would have had a better outcome, I think, but that was not the course that was chosen. And in this case, what you see is a very impressive performance by HTS. Now, we should keep in mind that what happens now depends very much on the ability of HTS leaders and those carryovers from the Syrian government that are working with them now to bring everybody together that they possibly can under the umbrella of this new government, so that you don't end up with a new civil war between the different factions that are in Syria. Noting that, of course, you have the Turkish-supported Free Syrian Army in the north, contiguous with the Turkish border. You have below that, if you will, HTS, which took Aleppo, then Hama, Homs, and Damascus. You still have the Syrian Democratic Forces, which are essentially the Syrian Kurds with some Sunni as well, that are supported by the US in the northeastern part of the country, which includes Raqqa, the former capital of the Islamic State. And they need to stay to keep an eye and pressure on the Islamic State. We've learned the hard way that if you don't do that, that forces like that can reconstitute. That's how the Islamic State was able to rebuild itself in the wake of the withdrawal of the US combat forces in late 2011. And then there are some other elements down in the south, and Dara up from Jordan. And again, it's not clear how closely aligned they are with HTS. And I don't know if the ambassador wants to nod and say they are. It's a work in progress, I think, in truth. They spontaneously stood up on their own. They used to be supported by Jordan and by the US. And then I should not forget, out in Al-Tanf, which is a city right on the border between Iraq and Syria, you have a radius around a refugee camp that is enforced by US forces, which have a base right there. And outside that, there's some opposition forces as well. There's an awful lot of desert in here. There are still some Syrian forces. And there's been a bit of dynamism as forces seized the Abu Kamal border crossing, which is very, very important because it's the one that through which the route from Iran into Iraq, along the Euphrates River Valley, and then into Syria, that's where that crossing is. That's the vital land link by which Iran has been resupplying, rebuilding, and sustaining Hezbollah, and that's no longer in place. Israel has also, I think, very impressively taken out what was left of the Syrian Navy, and I hope that the Syrians now will force the Russians out of their base in Tartus, which would be a real reversal for them as well. So that's the landscape here. And what will happen now is, again, an effort to bring everyone together, keeping in mind that you have many different ethnic groups, many different sectarian groups. Even within the Shia or the Sunni, there are different offshoots. There are different business groups, other elements of society. And as we encountered in the wake of the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime, if a country is left without overall leadership and order on the streets, terrible looting will set in, which could be as damaging or even more damaging than the war has been so far. And I hope that they will avoid the kind of very seriously misguided decisions that were made by the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq to fire the entire Iraqi military without telling them how we were going to provide for them and for their families, and then compounding that by firing the Ba'ath Party, the upper echelons of which clearly needed to be killed or captured. But when you included level 4, you actually included the bureaucrats in the orders of tens of thousands that we needed to help run a country that we didn't sufficiently understand. It was a huge blow. I was a 2-star general then, and it felt as if our knees were being cut out from underneath us by decisions that had not been laid out to us, and on which we were not able to provide feedback, and our feedback would have been, don't do it. As was the case with the US CIA station chief, who said, if you do that, you're going to have an insurgency on your hand in the morning, and that sadly proved to be correct. Iraq, I should mention here, the Shia militia there are not as unified as was the case with Hezbollah. Keep in mind that Iran has always wanted to Lebanonize Iraq, in other words, to achieve the kind of influence that Iran had in Lebanon, and still has to a considerable degree, with a very powerful militia on the ground and a coalition in the parliament that has a blocking veto. And they've never quite gotten to that in Iraq, although they do have a number of militias that they support that do have a fairly considerable capacity, and they do have a number of votes that are aligned with them, certainly, and aligned with these individual militias in the forms of political parties. And then you have Iran. Iran has seen its influence very seriously degraded in the Middle East. Its most important proxy, very heavily damaged. Hezbollah, another proxy, Hamas, dramatically degraded, not yet destroyed though, and it can keep reconstituting its people. And there's plenty of volunteers for Hamas 2.0, which is why, again, I have counseled that there needs to be the achievement of security, because without that, you can't carry out these other actions that I think are necessary, again, to provide a better life for the Palestinian people. We should also note that the response by the Israelis to the second direct attack from Iran on Israel, the one that consisted of ballistic missiles, hundreds of them, that was very, very impressive. And it damaged or destroyed every single one of the Russian advanced air and ballistic missile defense systems. It took out the solid rocket fuel capacity of Iran and did some other damage. But most importantly, what it showed is that advanced fighter aircraft, the F-35, can penetrate that airspace without worrying about the Russian S-300 and S-400. So again, they're on the back foot in that regard. And also, of course, their economy is suffering. The general population is very discontented. But that regime still, I think, is quite sturdy. And it includes not just hundreds of thousands, but you could put 2 million besieged militia on the streets if you have to in Iran to put down some kind of very significant uprising. And it will be interesting to see the direction that the Trump administration decides to take with Iran, because I think this weakening of Iran, the damage or destruction of its proxies, does put them in a position where I think we can do a lot to return to the maximum pressure and actually achieve some kind of negotiated solution or negotiation with Iran as well. So are there any additional ones that you want me to? I mean, the Houthis are still terrorizing the Red Sea, not as effectively. I think you'll see us hammer them more, and Israel will do the same thing in the months that lie ahead.
No, General, thank you for that very comprehensive overview. But several questions do arise from that.
One at a time, please.
Yeah, of course. You know, you're our guest. We shan't misuse you. The upshot of what you have said is that the so-called axis of resistance is left in shreds. It's severely degraded. It's severely degraded.
Very degraded, right? Yes.
Anyway, all right. Where does that leave Iran? It has given its best shot, its ballistic missiles, the second attack on Israel. Very few got through.
Actually, more got through than we realized initially. That was worrisome. And the whole reason that Israel waited to respond was because the U.S. deployed the additional elements, both soldiers and early warning and other systems, for what's called the THAAD system, which is a Theater High Altitude Area Air Defense System, to augment what Israel has, which is quite impressive. Iron Dome, David's Sling, Arrow. Even, I guess there's still some Patriot, I think, in the mix as well.
Yeah, but anyway, you know, the damage done was minimum. It's now with its conventional capabilities and its forward defense strategy, divided. What do you think how does that affect its calculations of going for a nuclear weapon?
Look, I'm sure that deep down they would love to wake up some morning and have a sizable nuclear arsenal and the means to deliver it. But they know they can't get to that because it is very, very clear that neither the U.S. nor Israel will allow them to have a nuclear weapon. And I was reassured to hear President Trump already say publicly that Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon, the same policy that President Biden had, President Trump before him, President Obama, and President Bush. And I can assure you that we have the capability to destroy the entire nuclear program if it comes to that. And we developed, it's publicly known, that plan was developed when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command. And it's also known that we actually rehearsed the plan one time within the confines of the United States, but flying all the distance that some of the more sophisticated systems would fly, drop the bombs that we would need to drop, and show that we have the capability to take out all the different targets that are there. And if you do it together with the Israelis, this would be an extraordinary operation.
Thank you. That's very reassuring to hear. Because if they go for a bomb, we'll have another big war.
No, I don't think so, actually.
You don't think so?
Look, I think, I mean, they'll try to respond, but if you, without getting too detailed, this is not a small operation.
No.
You take down all of the remaining integrated air and ballistic missile defense systems. You take down as much of the response capabilities as you possibly can, keeping in mind that some of our bases and the bases, obviously, of our Gulf state and even Israeli partners are within range of some of their systems. But they've already reduced their capacity very considerably, not with great effect. So we've even shown that they can't get through. If the U.S. is up there with some of our coalition partners and perhaps others in the region, then it's very possible that Israel will take down all the rest. So I think this has exposed them in a way that they're reminded that they're in a very difficult position. And we will know if they enrich to weapons grade.
Well, that's reassuring. But what it also says, I mean, what has happened last year has also shown that there's only one major external power that really counts, and that's the US. And therefore, maybe I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. What do you think the Trump administration's policy towards the Middle East will be in the second iteration?
Yeah, look, I hope that there is a recognition still of what we used to call the three truths when I was the Central Command commander. The first is, in the Middle East, never lose sight of who your enemies are and who your friends are. And Iran is our implacable enemy, two of whose goals are to destroy Israel and to destroy the U.S. presence in the Gulf region. And yes, we occasionally have differences with some of our friends and partners out there. The truth is that these relationships are rock solid when it comes to the military, the intelligence, and so forth. So that's truth number one. Truth number two is you have to keep in mind that Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens there does not stay there. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and in many cases, a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way, in some cases, into the countries of our most important allies in Europe. And we saw that before, of course, during the Syrian civil war. We've seen it also to some degree with refugees from Iraq, Afghanistan, North Africa, and so on. And one of the heartening developments is that refugees from Syria are already returning to Syria, which will take a lot of the pressure off Turkey if they're able successfully to get back to their homes, reestablish where it is that they used to live before the regime bullied them out of those or carried out such horrific actions. You know, the scenes from this prison that was run there were in which tens of thousands of largely political prisoners, there are some that have been there since the beginning of the Arab Spring in Syria, and they're there just because they happen to assemble peacefully to protest against the Bashar al-Assad regime. And then number three is the operative one here, and that is that you have to recognize that the U.S. trying to leave the Middle East is like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in. So I hope, and I know the individuals that are starting to populate the incoming administration, National Security Advisor, his deputy, the Secretary of State nominee, his deputy, and so forth. These are individuals who have been around for a long time. The National Security Advisor was a Green Beret Special Forces officer under me in a couple of different deployments in the two wars. And again, I think they are well acquainted with these three CENTCOM truths. That said, we know that President Trump is one who publicly states always he doesn't want to enter a new war. He said already about Syria, stay out of it, it's somebody else's. The fact is, I think the U.S. will be seeking to influence this in various ways, and in some cases we'll do it through others. Again, we can do it. The Qataris were big supporters of HTS. Turkey, to some degree, although there was a bit of a fractious relationship, because they were also supporting the Free Syrian Army, which is up here in a distinct area. But I think, again, inevitably, the U.S. force presence is going to be very substantial. Look, we already hit 70 plus targets of the Islamic State as coincidentally with what's going on with HTS. And it actually was not coincidental, because there was a concern that the regime forces that were keeping an eye on those that were outside the area of this, the Syrian Democratic Forces, might reconstitute in some way. But there's going to be some very interesting dynamics here, because you have the Turkish-supported Free Syrian Army, which have taken back already an area, a pocket that was, let me get it in your perspective, that was to the west of the Euphrates, Manbij, and they've actually pushed them out of that. And there will be differences between the Syrian Democratic Forces, which again, of course, are the Kurds who have some extended relationship with the PKK in Turkey. Sorry for the complexity, but you have to actually grasp all this to truly understand the dynamics in which you're going to pursue various policy objectives.
No, you made something that's very complex very clear, and I think the audience will agree with me on that.
And actually, if I could, it's been revealing that Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, has been on the phone with each of the Gulf states and others in the region, and of course Israel, discussing how all of them might influence this and try to ensure that HTS is as inclusive and as secular and as, again, not as Islamist as is absolutely possible.
Yeah, well, one can only hope, but I want to come back to an earlier point you made. One of the major foreign policy successes of the first Trump administration were the Abraham Accords.
Yes, yep.
Now, for that to go forward, some form of better life, to use your words, for the Palestinians will be necessary to bring Saudi Arabia on board and so on.
Yeah, I think it's going to be even more than that. I think it's not just a better life. I think it's going to be a firm path to a two-state solution. Keep in mind that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, they were very close to achieving, again, mutual recognition of Saudi Arabia and Israel. In other words, they would join the Abraham Accords, which already included, of course, the UAE. I don't know if there's a UAE representative in here, but the Emiratis have been very, very impressive in all of this as well. And of course, you had Bahrain. That was perhaps one of the reasons that Hamas attacked when they did, was that they feared that they were on the threshold of seeing this kind of rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia without as much attention to the Palestinian issue as was the case, say, a decade or more ago. But this has raised that case back up. And again, I don't know if there's a Saudi representative in here, but this is, I think, the bar has been raised very considerably over which Israel will have to get in this case. So it's not vague language now. I think it would be much firmer language and a firmer commitment. And of course, I normally don't do politics. I'm a soldier, not a diplomat or a politician, but we all know the complexity of the coalition that is ruling Israel right now, and it's very likely that that coalition would not hold together if there was some kind of ironclad commitment to a two-state solution, given the makeup of those that are on the right side of that coalition.
You just preempted my question, because you began by saying that it's very difficult to underestimate the amount of trauma in Israel of 7 October.
It has changed, and of course,
I was there just 2 months ago. It has changed considerably. I was surprised. I go every year, and just in that 1 year, it changed a lot.
The support for a two-state solution has really gone down. I mean, it used to be a bit over 50%. You've watched it go down over the years, and so now it's well below 50%.
So what kind of path to even a two-state solution as a very distant goal can you envisage?
Well,
and what kind of role do you think the U.S. can play in, I don't know, the U.S. should not get involved in internal politics of any country, but in recalibrating Israeli politics so that at least it right now, two-state solution in Israel is almost a bad word. Right? It's almost no support I could find, right? But you need something like that in order to stabilize these great strategic changes that you have described.
Well, I mean, again, I would start by suggesting that Israel to establish an objective and then operationalize it to provide a better life for the Palestinian people in Gaza, who are living in a very dire situation. This is a humanitarian catastrophe, and you're entering the winter season with very flimsy shelter and the rest of that. Humanitarian assistance is very troubled in getting in because, again, of the guys with guns. So again, you'd have to establish security, and also, I think, a commitment that there would not be the reestablishment of settlements in Gaza. I think it would be fine to have bases in there from which Israeli forces would be operating. Again, you have to live with the people to secure them. This is the lesson of the surge in Iraq. Prior to the surge, we were conducting what could be called clear and leave operations, and that was not sufficient. The violence just kept going up. But then when we conducted clear, hold, and build, in other words, classic counterinsurgency operations, keep in mind what's facing Israel in Gaza is not an organized Hamas structure of companies, battalions, brigades. They have all been rendered militarily ineffective. That doesn't mean they still don't have capability fighting as guerrillas and as insurgents. And the way to deal with an insurgency is to conduct a counterinsurgency. And yes, I understand that the Israelis are like where we were in 2003 or 4 or 5 even. They don't have a counterinsurgency field manual. They've never conducted counterinsurgency operations. They're conducting counterterrorism operations. It's a very different campaign. But we learned how to do that. And in this case, the area is so relatively manageable that you would learn by doing. And you just keep repeating what it is you do, go down a bit further. It'll be complicated, obviously, around Gaza City, which is nearly 1 million people, or was. But that is the only conceivable way that I can envision as a former soldier who did this during the surge in Iraq, which was quite a significant change for our forces. So I would make a commitment there that we're going to provide a better life for them. We will have a security presence until the Palestinians can gradually thicken us, Israelis, and allow us to thin out, but you still have to maintain a presence, and you probably still have to man many of the critical entry control points to ensure that they are enforced in terms of the biometric ID cards. That is a big issue, by the way, and the Israelis have tremendous biometric capability, and they have a tremendous amount of biometric data because the Hamas extremists conveniently uploaded so many of the videos of the horrific actions that they took that you can identify who the bad guys are. That's for Gaza. And then with respect to the West Bank, you say, okay, I understand the politics on neither side actually allow the kind of compromise that would be necessary, noting that, of course, the Palestinians walked away from an extraordinary opportunity with Ehud Olmert, who made very significant concessions, was prepared to do that. And they're in a vastly better or worse place as a result of that. But here I think it would be incumbent on Israel to say, okay, we will try to provide the conditions that would facilitate an eventual two-state solution. And by this I mean don't create more obstacles to a two-state solution than already exist in the West Bank, and try to support the institutional capacity building of the Palestinians so that when that day comes, there are not more obstacles and there are certain capabilities that are necessary for the Palestinians to gradually take over more of the responsibility for governing themselves in the West Bank. And then it would also be incumbent on the Palestinians to give up their policy of pay for slay, their education, which teaches young children to believe that Israelis are all, again, those with whom they could never have lived peacefully together and so forth. But that's a tall order, and I recognize that.
Yeah, it's a tall order, but a necessary order. Will take some time, though, I guess.
Yep.
I want to shift gear a bit, actually not a bit, quite drastically, before I turn over the floor to the audience, both online here, I want to shift gear. When we talk of the Middle East, we almost naturally, inevitably, and understandably talk about war, conflict, terrorism. But there is another story going on, at least in part of the Middle East, the Gulf, which is the efforts of the Gulf states, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, to basically retool their societies.
Big time. Yep,
and that's,
absolutely.
to me, the bigger story.
Yep.
Would you have any comments on that?
Oh, absolutely. You know, I'm a partner in KKR.
Yeah.
During the 11 and a half years I've been at KKR and I chair our Global Institute, we have grown from 83 billion under management to 625 billion under management. It'll be more than that when we announce the next quarter's results. It has been an extraordinary period, and I'm in the Gulf quite a bit. In fact, I was just in Abu Dhabi 3 days ago or 4 days ago at a gathering that was there, not the Formula One, by the way, the one and done, but for another gathering, and I'm very keenly aware of the efforts in the Gulf states. Also, I'd add Jordan in here and others, Egypt as well, but particularly the Gulf states, to develop the technologies of the future, building data centers, building large language models, building the energy infrastructure required to power those data centers. All of the efforts of Saudi Arabia to develop the parts of the economy that are not strictly based on fossil fuels. And you see that again through each of the states of the Gulf states. And it's really quite dramatic. You see the education that's going on. You see the secular approach to this, allowing those of other faiths and so forth. And it's really quite dramatic in some cases. And in some places and cases, it's actually downright breathtaking.
Well, I personally think that is the bigger story in the long term, whether they succeed or they fail.
I think it's going to succeed. I think there will be a successful transition. If you look at Dubai, which does not have the oil or natural gas that Abu Dhabi has, and yes, they have had to depend on Abu Dhabi when there have been significant downturns, such as the Great Recession. But what Dubai has done is build an economy that is around other sectors. So it's around hospitality, it's around entertainment, it's around transshipment, you know, the most unbelievable airfields and facilities and ports in the world. And Doha is doing a fair amount of this as well. You see it in the other of the Emirates, again, up and down, Bahrain, Kuwait, and so on. So I think this is very, very significant. And I think that they will actually be able to transition over time in a way that if we ever find peak demand, which is a good bit farther out, I think, than people continually assess as the case, especially as data centers. You know, data centers in the US right now take 2% of all of our energy. We expect that it'll take 8 to 10% just by the end of this decade. So these are transformational developments.
Thank you. I'm going to open the floor to the audience, but I'll give the first one to somebody online who wants you basically to expand on Turkey's position after the events of the last week or so.
Well, I think Turkey is in a much stronger position than it was just a couple of weeks ago. Now, that's a result of years, though, of work. And again, keep in mind that Turkey is not the supporter of HTS. They're the supporter of the Free Syrian Army. They're concerned about the Syrian Democratic Forces, although I think there are enough safeguards there, but I understand their position very well, given the challenges and the horrific extremist activities of the PKK over decades. But they are close to HTS. Again, I would say if you have to rank order who was it that supported HTS most significantly, first of all, it would be the organic elements of HTS, and then it would be actually what they captured from the Syrian regime forces over the years, but then it would be Qatar, which I think has been the one that is most directly linked with them and supporting them over the years. Recalling that all the way back when I was the director of the CIA, because of the lack of serious U.S. commitment, you ended up with a number of the different Gulf states supporting different elements in Syria in that civil war, which was not helpful, frankly.
Okay, I'll take questions from the floor. Just two ground rules.
Could I?
Please identify yourself and make sure it's a question, not a speech.
One other very important development here when it comes to Turkey is that Turkey has hosted millions of Syrian refugees over the years, some that continued on to Europe, but millions are still on their soil, and they've really been quite hospitable to them. But this is a big issue politically for President Erdogan. And if this ends up in allowing millions of these to go back home, that'll be a very positive development for Turkey.
Okay, Ambassador?
Yes, thank you very much, General. It was amazing. I wanted to ask you regarding the International Criminal Court. We've been exposed in the last days to horrific atrocities committed by Bashar al-Assad, and nothing has been done by the ICC. Instead of that, the ICC issued arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu, who is going to be in power for so many years to come. And do you think that the ICC is a relevant institution when democracies have to defend themselves? I mean, I'm not taking only the Israeli case study, I'm taking the American case study, and I'm asking that because I've been reading declarations of the Trump administrations about the delegitimization of the ICC.
Well, the current administration too, which certainly did not applaud what took place with respect to your prime minister and at the time your minister of defense. And I think listed one person in Hamas. Now, to be fair, a number of the likely candidates for ICC designation were dead, so they weren't available for that. But the one they chose probably is dead, I think is probably the assessment. Look, I was a policy implementer for an earlier ICC issue, which had to do with the former Yugoslavia. I was a one-star on the ground. I was the chief of operations for the NATO Stabilization Force, but it's publicly known now, I was the deputy commander of a clandestine joint task force that was doing the war criminal hunt. And the war criminal hunt was carried out against those who were designated. There were warrants for those of the International Criminal Court. In that case, it seemed to me that this was very, very relevant. This ultimately brought to justice Milosevic, Karadzic, also others, though, from some of the other factions of that civil war that were so murderous in what they carried out. I think in the time there, we got the majority of the colonels, for example, that were at Srebrenica and carried out that horrific killing, murder there. So in that case, again, it seemed to me, and I was actually helping implement that policy, that was a valid, important endeavor to show that people could not get away with that kind of activity again. This case obviously is much, much more debatable, to put it mildly. It seems as if it has edged into sort of international politics instead of international jurisprudence. I'm not a lawyer, so I could defer to that on that to others. But it clearly has called its legitimacy into question by doing this. And the U.S. inevitably is, as the current administration already has, and I'm sure the coming administration will do even more so, given its traditional strong support for Israel, has again called American support into question very significantly. So I think there's going to have to be some stock taking in The Hague or wherever it is that this convenes on future issues like this.
Okay, I see 3 hands up, 4 hands up. First Steve, then Choi, and then is that you, Hassan? All right, and then yeah, okay, Fazal.
Hey,
please
General.
introduce yourself. I know
Steve
you,
Okun.
but the rest may not.
We've seen, boycotts against U.S. companies because of the U.S. policy towards Israel, and in Malaysia in particular, Starbucks, McDonald's, KFC. As the Trump administration comes in with what seems to be a very pro-Israel administration with, Governor Huckabee and what he said about whether the Palestinians even exist as a people. Should we be concerned, U.S. businesses, U.S. investors, about what could happen as a Trump administration becomes more pro-Israel to reaction here in this part of the world and others?
Yeah, I think you always should be concerned about those kind of possibilities. This is what the KKR Global Institute does. We identify geopolitical risks generally during the diligence process, but also separately from that. And we're constantly trying to figure out what are the risks as we're assessing potential investments, but also what are the risks to the existing investments that we have, and how do we mitigate those risks. So yes, I think this is something about which we should be concerned. And I should note, for example, we de-risked our entire portfolio with respect to Ukraine and Russia back in 2014. We did it again in late 2021 in advance of that invasion. Now, you can never fully de-risk something. There are always elements of the residual activities and so forth. But no, I think this is something that, just as you are also concerned about what are other trends, what is happening for other reasons, that are just much more the results of market forces and allocation of resources and so forth. So I think that is something about which to be concerned, although I would note that the incoming administration is led by somebody who almost revels in responding to those kind of activities with threats of various types, not all of which are going to be carried through, but they are issued to try to gain an advantage in negotiations that then might follow. But I think that's an awful lot of what is going on with the tariffs that are being threatened and so on, that keep your adversary or your negotiating partner a little bit off balance in this kind of thing. And the art of the deal, I'm sure, will shoot back up the New York Times bestseller list as people try to find out what it might tell them about these kinds of issues and his negotiating style.
Okay. Choi?
Yeah, Choi Shing Kwong. I'm from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies here in Singapore. I'd like to, sort of bring you, although you say you're a general, not a politician, I'd like to take a little longer term perspective and raise two issues that haven't really been raised so much. First of all, US politics. Basically, the way that US politics is going, I think that there's a lot more concern about resources going elsewhere, and perhaps the Defense Department is not going to be the recipient of quite the same level of resources going forward. A lot more about rebuilding America. And will that actually allow the US armed forces to have the type of capability that you talked about, which is, you mentioned, as really very critical to keeping the Middle East together? Okay, that's the first trend. The second trend is related. One of the reasons why the US policy is kind of moving away from the armed forces emphasized on the Middle East is because of China, right?
Yes.
So China is the big challenger. China is also the big economic challenger. And in that sense, as the pressure comes on future administrations, even beyond the current Trump administration, to shift more attention and to shift more capability to addressing Chinese threats, how is that going to affect the prognosis of going forward? Thank you.
So let me take the latter question first. And here I should note that I was one who very much objected to the term pivot. I thought pivot, which was traditionally pivoting away from the Middle East toward the Indo-Pacific, I think it scared our partners and allies in the region, and it gave a bit of hope to our adversaries. And the right term, which we only should have used, was rebalance. Yes, the Indo-Pacific is more important. Yes, we're going to have more emphasis there than we were when we had 250,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines under my command and U.S. Central Command, when we had two full-blown wars going on and also some half wars going on in other places like Yemen and the pirate-infested waters off Somalia. And so naturally we were going to draw down our force to a degree, but this is where that realization that I mentioned earlier, the third CENTCOM truth, that you just can't leave the Middle East. Recognize that, try to get the right capabilities, the right forces, always try to do it in support of host nation or local forces where you can, as we have very impressively done with the Syrian Democratic Forces, as we did, frankly, in supporting the Iraqi security forces. They're the ones on the ground who actually destroyed the Islamic State, albeit with our intelligence capacity, our intelligence fusion, our precision munitions from unmanned and manned systems and so forth. So a bit of a different approach in this regard. Instead of doing it ourselves, doing an advise, assist, and enable approach to these different challenges that are out there. And I think that certainly is going to continue. I think there is a recognition that we need to maintain a substantial presence in the Gulf region, perhaps not quite as big as we have right now, given all that we have devoted there to making sure that the Iranians cannot penetrate the Israeli air and ballistic missile defenses, and therefore we should help them in that regard. But clearly the Indo-Pacific, it's, in geopolitics writ large, it is all China all the time. And that is the most important relationship in the world, that between China and the US and its allies and partners. If you think of the US as the guy keeping a lot of plate spinning simultaneously, like the guy in the circus, and recognize that we have allies and partners that help us uniquely to do many of these plates. The plate that represents the relationship with China, that plate is bigger than all the others in the tent, and that's a reality. And we have to do everything we can to ensure that that deterrence is absolutely rock solid. And deterrence is a function of two elements: the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to use them on the other. And with respect to the second of those, you have to absolutely realize that what you do in one part of the world reverberates in others. And if you're not willing to help the Ukrainians in their hour of need as they're fighting for their very survival and independence, why would they believe that you're going to help someone else who might be under pressure? And the same is true if we don't help Israel and the Gulf states as required, then again, why would they believe this? And I think the red line in Syria that turned out not to be a red line over the use of chemical weapons undermined deterrence. I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan that was not necessary. Sustainability of an operation depends on the cost to you in blood and treasure. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months in combat, and the expense was very, very sustainable for the U.S., $25 billion out of an $850 billion defense budget. There is pressure certainly on to then speak about the capabilities of our military forces. There is going to be pressure, undoubtedly. There are two conflicting inclinations here. One is the very substantial proportion of the party that's coming into power in both houses of Congress and the White House to be strong on defense, peace through strength and so forth, and many of the initial individuals. But then there's also going to be increasing pressure from a fiscal standpoint. Keep in mind that there's a big difference from the time that President Trump assumes office next January, 8 years earlier. When he took office in January 20th, 2017, the US debt to GDP ratio was 75%, going down, and real interest rates were zero. So servicing that debt was quite doable. 8 years later, the debt to GDP ratio, in part because of COVID, in part because of some tax cuts by the previous administration, et cetera, which they want to extend, the debt to GDP ratio is 100% going up, and real interest rates are at least 2%. So this is a very different landscape, and there will be pressure on the discretionary part of the budget, the lion's share of which is the Department of Defense, just as there will probably be pressure in some of the entitlements, some of which are sort of the third rail of politics. You know, you touch it and you get electrocuted. But if you're serious about getting the debt to GDP ratio going down instead of up, servicing the debt now costs more than what we spend on defense. So there are going to be these countervailing pressures. What I think is actually a more important question is, can we accelerate the transformation of our forces from what simplistically might be described as a small number of very large platforms that are incredibly capable, heavily manned, excessively expensive actually, and increasingly vulnerable, because anything on the surface of the water and above can be seen in today's era of ubiquitous surveillance. Transition from that, some of those at least, because these are still useful out in the Gulf among other places, to a massive number of unmanned systems that increasingly are not going to be remotely piloted, but will be algorithmically piloted, as is already happening in the extraordinary innovation that I've witnessed in Ukraine, where I've been 4 times just in the last 18 months alone. That is a bigger question in my mind, actually, because that's what needs to happen with much greater urgency, recognizing what Senator McCain used to term the military-industrial congressional complex. In each of those elements, there are vested interests in preserving legacy systems, legacy basing arrangements, legacy processes which are inadequate. Our processes now are generally producing yesterday's technology for tomorrow's war, whereas the Ukrainians, by the way, are producing tomorrow's technology for today's war. And we really need all of us, actually, to learn from what the Ukrainians are doing. And of course, nothing forces innovation like the prospect of losing your independence and your very existence.
Thank you. Hassan, you had a question? Introduce yourself for the rest.
Yeah, I'm Hassan Jaffrey. I do political consulting and I work with Temasek. I have a couple of questions. First, welcome back to Singapore.
Hey.
I'd like to draw your mind to 2 continuums with regards to Syria. One is, would the response to Syria be a nation-building exercise, which is a tendency America usually has, or would it be more purely a short-term security-oriented orientation? Right? The second is with regards to HTS. I'm of the view that it's very difficult to accept that their fundamental positions are going to change. But I'd like your view in terms of their own orientation. Are they closer, or will they be closer to the Taliban, or would they be closer to AKP in Turkey in terms of their own orientation? Thank you.
So the answer to each of these is neither. There will not be a nation-building exercise led by the U.S. That I can assure you of. The truth is, there's plenty of countries and capabilities in the Gulf and outside the Gulf that can come in as well, if the money is there, that can provide the nation building. And I know that, again, there are those who believe that it all went wrong in Afghanistan when we started nation building, or in Iraq. The problem with that is, if you don't do nation building, you don't have forces and other institutions and capabilities that can assume the roles that you are actually performing in those countries by necessity. We should have gotten on with nation building much sooner in Afghanistan and taken advantage of the periods of very, very low violence there. I remember doing an assessment there in late 2005 as a 3-star coming home from my 3-star tour in Iraq. I was stunned at how much lower the violence was there, but also stunned by how far behind they were what we were doing in Iraq, because we focused so almost completely on Iraq. So I think there will be nation building. The question is, how can it be coordinated? How can it be observed? How do you avoid the kind of waste, abuse, corruption, and so forth that often becomes part of those kinds of endeavors? And I don't think short-term security is the answer either. Again, I think there's going to have to be a long-term commitment to supporting presumably an HTS-led government of some type. And this is the real question, is will HTS demonstrate the kind of inclusiveness, flexibility, negotiating, and all the rest of that to bring together a country that has split because of the different factions in that country, and then to try to get it back together and all working together to a common objective. And that, I think, is a big, big question after 50 years of rule by a small minority, not even a large minority, but a very small minority, the Alawite Shia, that were, of course, the regime. You know, has HTS fundamentally changed? I think it actually has, but we'll only know in the weeks and months that lie ahead. Certainly the rhetoric has been very reassuring, and the actions have been reassuring so far. They're allowing Christians, they're allowing others, other minorities, if you will, noting that, of course, Syria is more than 60% Sunni Arab. And again, they should be ruling just as, frankly, in Iraq, where you similarly had a minority regime, a larger minority regime in the form of the Saddam Hussein Sunni-led regime. I don't think they'll be the Taliban. I don't think they're certainly not going to take the country back to an 8th century interpretation of ultra-conservative Islam. The question is, how much is Islamism, how much is Islamic politics guide them? And I certainly don't think they're going to be a terrorist group like the PKK. First of all, I mean, the difference is they're going to be in charge, so that's different. I'm sorry. Yeah, I don't think so. But again, this is one. Leaders matter, big ideas matter, and we'll see in the weeks that lie ahead whether this leader can develop the kind of powerful, big ideas that are needed to bring a country back together that has been in civil war for 10 years, more than 10 years.
Fazia?
Thank you, Bilahari. Fazlur Rahman, I'm a board member of Middle East Institute. General, I was actually working in Qatari Bank when you were the commander of Central Command, and we had the KC-135 at Al Udeid. Thank you for the comprehensive analysis. Being a Singaporean, I'd like to bring back what lessons and strategic considerations for Singapore, what's happening right now in the Middle East, being mindful that there are certain sectors which relate Singapore as Israel in Southeast Asia. You have also alluded in terms of where the Gulf region, and of course, I live in Qatar, travel around Middle East, I've seen what's happening. And in fact, you mentioned Dubai. Muhammad Ali Al-Abbar actually learned from late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and developed Dubai like Singapore. So looking at what's happened in the Gulf, with respect to the bigger Middle East, with the conflicts, and in Singapore, what we are doing with respect to the region, with our neighbors. So what are some of the lessons and strategic considerations for Singapore? Thank you.
In all honesty, I think it might be more the other way around. In fact, I used to refer to Sultan Qaboos as the Lee Kuan Yew of the Middle East. That's a decade or more ago when I was the CENTCOM commander or CIA director. More recently, I think you've actually seen quite enlightened figures with considerable authority guide countries very impressively. Or even Emirates very impressively. I mean, the leader of Dubai, again, extraordinary vision. Leader of Abu Dhabi, extraordinary vision. The overall emir, I think you've seen to a considerable degree the same in Qatar, the same in Bahrain, which of course doesn't have the kind of resources that these other two have. I think MBS in Saudi Arabia is filling that role in considerable ways. Certainly some missteps along the way. And you've seen this in Oman again, I think, as well. The question is, of course, how does one exercise so much authority without ultimately ending up like Mubarak or the leader of Tunisia or Gaddafi? And I think this is more the exception than the rule. The rule is that figures with great authority become truly authoritarian until the people have had enough and they fill Tahrir Square or whatever. So I think in that case, and then I would also observe, I thought it was very instructive in Singapore. I remember coming out, I think it was late 2011, but correct me if I'm wrong. I was the director of the CIA, and I arrived, and the station chief met me, and he said, "Sir, you know, this election has been disastrous for the ruling party. Democracy is teetering on an edge. We're not sure if this can continue forward." And I think it was because the ruling party had only gotten 70% of the vote, or 65% instead of the normal 75 or 80%. And my recollection is that, you know, this is the assessment. This is tenuous. There are cracks appearing, that people may no longer support this. And what happened, of course, is that the leaders, the party leaders and so forth, sat down, did some serious stock taking, serious introspection, made significant changes, communicated them effectively to the people, implemented them, and lo and behold, got back to the margins of victory that they used to enjoy. And I think that, you know, the real question there is, how can others embrace the kind of approach that was taken here in the wake of something that was seen as a setback, and restore the kind of support, faith in the government, and so on. And I think that's the real genius. And I'd also offer that the education system is one that always just continually stands out. I had Singaporean officers actually on my staff in Afghanistan. It's little known. They were in combat, by God. And they were far and away the most educated officers that we had. I think each of them had multiple degrees from MIT or Stanford or some of the Ivy League schools, whatever it was. And I remember giving them a problem that nobody else in the staff could solve, and I did it just for the heck of it, to give them something to do. I didn't know, what do we do, these guys? And lo and behold, they came back with a solution. And I wish I could remember what the problem was, because it was one that no one else could resolve. No one else could propose a solution. And they came back in about 3.5 days and had it all sorted out and laid out all the steps and details that would be required. So I think it's more the other way around, the example that, but of course, Singapore is a bit of an inflection point itself, trying to figure out, how do you go forward? How do we need to make changes to our economic model? What kind of tweaks do we need? And of course, the transition from one generation to the next. I actually sat down with former Prime Minister Lee the other day, and also with one of the other senior ministers, and with a smile asked them, well, how is the new generation taking your advice? And they each said that, well, they're listening very intently and politely, and we'll see how much of it they actually follow. But so that, I think, is again quite remarkable. I say that, by the way, as a partner in a firm that has had its own succession. And this is not smooth in most of our counterparts in the United States. And yet we've had a very, very smooth transition from the two principal founders, Henry Kravis and George Roberts, who many in here will know literally invented the private equity industry, and then many of the other innovations since then, to our new co-CEOs. But I'll also note they're sort of in the senior minister role. They are co-executive chairman still, and they still show up in the office every single day and put in longer days in most cases than do some of our new people.
Thank you. I think Singapore politics is sui generis, and we are always at an inflection point, changing before we need to.
You know, come to think of it, you're right, because every time I come in, they say, oh my God, you know, there's some new challenge they're grappling with, and lo and behold, I come back, you know, 6 months later, and they've resolved it.
All right. Brian, is it?
Hello. Hi, General Petraeus. Good to hear from you.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Kumar Ramakrishna, from Dean of the Rajaratnam School in Nanyang Technological University. My question is actually related to something which one of my colleagues here asked regarding HTS, the nature of HTS. What do you think are the implications of the HTS victory, if you could call it that, Syria, for the evolution of global jihadism? I mean, what do you think are the implications in particular for ISIS and Islamic State and Al-Qaeda? I mean, does the HTS model seem to suggest that if you really want to be a successful jihadist organization, you cannot carry on the way ISIS and Al Qaeda are doing. In other words, you need to be able to like localize yourself. You need to compromise. You need to moderate yourself. You need to be open to new ideas. Do you think that this is one implication for future evolution or the likes of these organizations?
Yeah, it's
Thanks.
a good question. I think, again, each of these is a unique situation because you see the Taliban that certainly didn't moderate itself and is back in power, and it still is quite consolidated, that power. Yes, there is an opposition, but it's not carrying out particularly significant operations each year. And I know all of them, of course, because they were all parts of the previous administrations in Afghanistan, and some of the very best of them, as a matter of fact. And of course, they've taken their country back to, again, the 8th or 9th century interpretation of ultra-conservative Islam. 50% of the population can't go to high school, much less college now. 50% can't really do much outside the house without a male guardian. And now it's even, they're mandating certain, a man has to have a fist-length beard. This kind of stuff is really quite substantial. And of course, they've completely undermined the economy. Over 50% of the population is malnourished, et cetera, et cetera. So, and yet they're holding on to power. In fact, consolidating that power. The Islamic State, it's conceivable if they had not carried out overseas terrorist operations that were quite significant in Europe. We forget how serious those were in France and Belgium and a number of other cases, and some that were interrupted. And if it hadn't been for the substantial number of refugees, I don't know whether or not there would have been the same amount of attention to them in Syria, at the least. I mean, in Iraq, certainly you're going to see that. But without what they did there, without U.S. support, I'm not sure how long it would have taken for the Iraqis to actually clear Mosul, for example, which still took the better part of a year with our very substantial support to actually clear. And in this case, the other question is there a capacity among these extremists, the really true, again, Islamist extremists, is there a capacity for self-reflection that would lead them to adopt a more moderate stance or not? And I'm not sure that is by any means universal. In fact, it is probably more the exception, again, than the rule. If you think of Hamas, which is, in my view, very much an Islamist extremist organization. And by the way, by definition then, as was the case with Al Qaeda in Iraq, our view was that if you are Islamist extremist, you are not reconcilable. Keep in mind, we reconciled with 103,000 Iraqis, 80,000 former low-level Sunni insurgents, and 23,000 low-level Shia militias supported by Iran. But in my view, again, so you look at Hamas, I don't believe that by any means the bulk of Hamas is actually reconcilable. We actually created an intelligence element in the multinational force Iraq headquarters that their sole job was to determine who is reconcilable and who is not. That's a big deal, because if you're judged to be irreconcilable, you are going to be captured or killed. There's no other option. A couple of them fled, but by and large, most of them stayed, and they ended up on the X, as we say, for our special mission units. And again, I just don't know that there's a capacity in these groups for the kind of, if you will, rational thinking from our perspective that would lead them to moderate and become, again, good neighbors for Israel, which they clearly were not.
Okay, we are coming to the end of the time. We have time for one more round of questions. And very conveniently, I saw 3 hands.
But we're still one at a time, please.
Well, you're of course one at a time.
Can't group them.
Ambassador?
Thank you, Ambassador Kausikan and General Petraeus for this wonderful presentation and your leadership and friendship to Jordan and the region. My question is simple. Given the tremendous U.S. leadership in creating the Middle East peace process back in '91, following a big war, which was the Iraq War, And same goes to Annapolis, the vision for two states, and even the Trump peace plan that articulated a Palestinian state.
Yep.
Do you believe, General, that it might be, viable for the U.S. to articulate the two-state solution as a national security interest of the United States? Thank you.
I'd be hesitant to use the term Bible, given some of the issues in that region when it comes to different faiths. But I do think that the Trump administration's product is a departure point. It's certainly something that should be returned to. I also think that, again, what former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has put forward together with a Palestinian notable figure is very much worth considering. Again, people tend to think of the missed opportunity for the Palestinians as Camp David in the final months or year or so of the Clinton administration. As you know, there were two more opportunities. You had Ehud Barak, who put forward, again, and these were big compromises, and then most significantly, Ehud Olmert. What he put forward was very, very considerable. You can argue that it may have actually been one of the factors that led ultimately to him not being able to continue as a prime minister, but I thought these were courageous. And tragically, the Palestinian leadership at the time just didn't feel sufficiently comfortable. Abu Mazen just didn't, I guess, feel that he could deliver on the Palestinian side, and so he missed a truly golden opportunity. And if that had been implemented, the situation would be vastly different for the Palestinians now than it is, because the developments since then in the West Bank have all created new obstacles to a two-state solution, rather than creating the institutions and opportunities and conditions that would be conducive to a two-state solution when the leadership on both sides felt that they could do that. And there really hasn't been Israeli leadership since then that has sought to advance that, typically because, again, of the coalition around those prime ministers. And clearly the Palestinian side has gotten more and more and more tenuous and unable to take the kind of courageous actions that would be necessary. I mean, you're king, and please give Jalal Abdullah my best. We had so many sessions together over the years in such a close relationship, and his deft handling of the situation in a country where the Jordanians are now heavily outnumbered by the Palestinians has really been an example for everybody in the region, I think. And very heavily challenged now. But should we go back to those? Absolutely. And again, I would offer, I think maybe even more relevant would be what Ehud Olmert has put together with this Palestinian leader. Doesn't achieve, I'm sure, 50% support in Israel, but it is still, I think, that's a blueprint that is worth examining.
Thank you. Rohan?
By the way, you all should see the timer up here. They keep putting extra time on it.
No,
I mean,
no.
it's just,
I'm ignoring this.
I need something like that in my life.
No, this has gone wonky. Ignore the timer.
General, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. I am a professor of security studies from Singapore, Rohan Gunaratne. My question to you is, what will happen in Ukraine? How will the Russian-Ukrainian war pan out? Thank you very much.
Sure, it's a great question. I think I mentioned earlier, I've been there 4 times just in the last 18 months alone. And my experience there literally dates all the way back to when it was a Soviet republic. I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army who made the first visit to the Soviet Union since General George C. Marshall went to Yalta in the final year of World War II. So it was quite historic and quite a moment, and then many, many times since then. Having said that, I'm also a former economics professor, and with that background, I always answer my questions with the words, "It depends." And it does depend in this case. In my view, if we want to create conditions that might actually be conducive to a ceasefire that is sustainable, we should be doing even more than we are for Ukraine right now to enable them to convince Putin that he can no longer achieve additional gains on the battlefield at acceptable cost. Now, that may be a tall order, given that Russia has sustained 700,000 killed and wounded, 500,000 of which did not return to the battlefield. In other words, were killed or so seriously wounded they couldn't go back to their units. These are just staggering casualties. I actually can't understand this, actually. Again, as someone who, in 5 combat commands, just as a general officer, wrote letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers multiple times on almost every night. I don't know, and of course he doesn't do letters of condolence, I'm sure, and is not that concerned, but still he has to be worried that there's a moment at which Russia's mothers and fathers, even in the rural areas, even with a whole year's salary as a bonus if you enlist, say, not our son. Maybe that is beginning to happen. You're seeing them bring in North Koreans or recruiting in Yemen. I hope that those are indicators that he's worried about the ability to continue to recruit because they have such a substantial manpower advantage over Ukraine. So that's first on which it depends. If you can get to that position, then I think you could actually achieve a ceasefire, given that President Zelensky now openly says something he never did before, in part because he can sense the war weariness, not just in his military on the front lines, but in the population in general, something I experienced the last time I was there, but several months ago, for the first time in all of my visits. They're still very resilient, but there's a recognition that if we give up 20% of the territory that Russia controls, most of it is devastated anyway. It's also not the kind of economic element that is the future of Ukraine. That the future of Ukraine is not going to be Soviet-style extractive industries and massive steel plants and this kind of thing. It's going to be IT skills, unmanned systems, robotics, all of those which are shown so impressively in the innovation that is enabling Ukraine to deal with an enemy that is many times their number and heavily outguns them, but they're limiting to incremental gains on a daily basis. But there are incremental gains, and there are continued casualties for Ukraine as well. Then it depends also, of course, on continued strong European support. I think that will be the case, on continued American support. I think that will be the case, although the chief executive may not be as enthusiastic about this, given that the testy relationship with President Zelensky in the previous term, although he's already had 2 meetings with President Zelensky, most recently in Paris, where there seems to be a degree of rapprochement, if you will, or a budding relationship. And keep in mind that on Capitol Hill, there is a very strong bipartisan support in the House and the Senate for continued assistance to Ukraine. And then I think it would also depend on there being an ironclad security guarantee to Ukraine. Without that, I don't think Ukraine can actually accept a ceasefire, because all it would do would be to allow Russia to take a knee for a couple of years, rebuild all their forces, replenish the armored vehicles and the incredible losses that they've sustained in their weapon systems as well, and then have another go at it, just as they took them years after Crimea and the Donbass to position themselves for what they did in 2022. So again, a number of factors there. There's also the element of innovation that is critically important here. Ukraine produced 1.5 million drones in the first 9 months of this year. That is the difference, again, for them against an enemy who, again, heavily outguns them. Keep in mind what Ukraine has done in the Black Sea is extraordinary. They've sunk 1/3 of the Black Sea fleet without a navy. And they've done it with unmanned aircraft that find the Russian ships and unmanned maritime drones that sink them. And they've forced them out of the Western Black Sea, including the port of Sevastopol, in which they'd had ships for centuries. And now they can ship grain to Egypt and to other North African countries, which is food security for those countries and significant revenue for Ukraine, which can only do that by ship. The other routes are much more challenging and much more costly. So I think again, the only way you can answer it is by saying it depends. You can list the elements on which it depends, and then we'll see how they play out over the months that lie ahead. Noting that President Trump has already identified a retired three-star General Keith Kellogg, who was actually my boss in the 82nd Airborne Division when he was the division commander and I was a brigade commander. He was the National Security Advisor for the Vice President in the first term. And we'll see if he's able to get traction and to bring together these elements that I've laid out, without which I don't think you can actually achieve a real ceasefire that could be enduring.
Thank you. Final question, the gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Ambassador Kausikan. Good afternoon, General Petraeus, Ambassador Kausikan. My name is Jonathan. I'm a lecturer at the local Institute of Higher Learning. So my question is, as we close off the year, how would you evaluate the strategic importance of Middle Eastern energy resources in the context of a global energy transition and its impact on the US geopolitical priorities in the region? Thank you.
Well, I think it's still accurate to say that crude oil, natural gas, and distillates and other products that come out of the Gulf largely fuel the global economy. There are some significant differences over, say, a decade or 15 years ago, the most important of which is that the U.S. has become a net exporter of crude and a huge exporter of LNG as well. I think, in fact, it is now conceivable that the U.S. could be the biggest exporter of LNG in the world. Australia and Qatar are still ahead of it considerably. But as we bring more liquefaction plants online and continue to produce more natural gas, and that's a very, very significant development. I don't think a decade ago anyone believed that the U.S. would be a net exporter of crude either. Keep in mind, we're not self-sufficient. We still need more heavy crude than we produce, and we export a lot of the light crude because our refineries are set up in that way. So we still have to get heavy crude from Canada, from even Venezuela and some other places, Mexico and so on. But that is a really, really significant development because the swing producer now in the world is no longer necessarily in the Middle East, although yes, OPEC decisions are very, very important when it comes to the price of Brent crude and so forth. But at the end of the day, it's the U.S. increase or reduction in drilling and production that really is what is influencing the markets so profoundly. But still, again, the crude, natural gas, distillates, other products that come out of here are fueling China, certainly, a number of other countries. India still to a degree, although of course it's Russian crude that has been consumed there increasingly and at reduced prices, of course, as well. But were you to see, we're often asked, what is the implication for geopolitics or for global economics? Because again, what we do is not just do interesting stuff for KKR, it has to be relevant. What is the meaning of this for, again, this particular part of the global economy, this particular country, this particular sector, this particular industry? And what's interesting is that what happens in the Middle East really doesn't matter that much to the global economy unless it affects the supply of crude, natural gas, distillates, and other products. That's really the question. Even the Houthi activity that has reduced traffic through the Suez Canal by some 70 to 80%, hugely important to Egypt, obviously, big reduction in their tariffs for that. But even the market pretty quickly priced in an extra 12 days or so of steaming time, higher insurance because of what's going on in the Red Sea, and then the container shortage for a period of time, but then it worked it out. You can't do that if demand is cut by, say, 5 or 10%, or not demand, supply is cut by 5% of the overall. Remember when Iran hit the Abqaiq oil facility and took out about 5 million barrels per day? It was roughly 5% of the global oil supply. That would have had huge ramifications had they not been able to bring it all back online as quickly as they did. But what's happening in North America, notwithstanding Australia, a couple of other places in the world, it still is very, very important that Mideast oil, gas, and related petroleum products get out to the rest of the world.
Well, thank you, General. Actually, it's been quite remarkable about how little disruption this long war has caused, all things considered.
Yes, yep.
Anyway, all things must come to an end, including listening to your fascinating presentation. Any final thoughts for us? Words of wisdom?
Sure. Look, first of all, these events here have always been very, very stimulating, at least from my perspective. This is a wonderfully informed audience. What you've done with this institute in your great national university is, I think, very, very impressive. It's one of the critical masses of intellectual understanding of the Mideast, and I think it's a tribute to all of you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be part of it from time to time. The other reality I think that this represents is something about Singapore itself, which is that Singapore has, for decades, brought together a population that has quite a few different ethnic and sectarian and other elements in it, and has forged a common pursuit and a common direction in a way that is very impressive and is an example for the rest of the world as well. So, I guess in a second you're going to applaud us. The truth is that I applaud you in what all of you have done.
Thank you. On that very high note, we better end before it because only can get worse. Thank you very much, General.
Thank you very much. Could I ask both of you to stay on stage so that we can give you a token of appreciation? Thank you very much, General. Just there. Bilahari. Well, that's a bit bulky, a bit bulky. Thank you all very much for joining us for the last event for the Middle East Institute for this year. Thank you.